Thank the gentlelady. We now go to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend you again on these hearings. I appreciate the way you've structured them and the fact that you've focused on this repeatedly because it's such an important topic and, at least from my perspective, taken a bipartisan approach in doing so. So thank you so much for that. I did have a question. I think this is for Dr. Jensen. You mentioned I think it was 44% of small businesses are most at risk in the United States for these sorts of cyber attacks. And I think there was a suggestion about perhaps we could provide some sort of subsidy or some incentives to help these companies protect themselves. Having come out of a small business, it was a law firm that was victimized in this way, and we had to pay ransomware. I'm sure there's, probably millions of companies who need this kind of assistance but can't afford it, or just on the day-to-day calculation, you're doing your risk analysis, you just try and keep your head low and do your work, but it's going to be a problem. So what sorts of things could we as Congress do to help provide, whether it's incentives or subsidies or something, to help these small businesses protect themselves?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that question, and sorry about the Orioles.
I'm a Nats fan, so I'm, beyond sorrow, I think. Total grief, I think, is where we are. But
yeah.
Apparently, that's not a bipartisan shared belief here. The sympathy is limited.
Yeah, generative AI is not going to make better baseball players, so we're going to be hurting for a while. This is a critical question for someone who grew up, raised by also a family that thinks about it. My parents owned a small business. And so exactly what you're talking about, I watch daily. I mean, I know it sounds like kitchen table issues, but it was like, are we hiring someone? Are we firing someone? So the idea of imagining my mom and dad having to think about spending money on cybersecurity just blows my mind when I think about it. And I think the path ahead for you in Congress is you actually have a great case study in the evolution of CISA. So I think if you actually go back and look at all the fits and false starts, really from 2000 forward, as we formed DHS, you began to pull in different agencies and kind of really lay that out, I think that'll give an interesting roadmap. Because even though CISA has taken the lead in defending the .gov, that's over 100 different agencies, each that are very different with all sorts of diverse concerns. So I think that actually is a great case study to start with and see what worked, what didn't. The good news is, not to be a shameless self-plug, we're actually launching a big report on that history Monday at CSIS. So we actually detail that history and talk about how do you actually balance that right. But at a minimum, I would think there has to be some type of funding provision. So for example, CISA will fund for those federal agencies, they get the first 2 years of continuous diagnostic and monitoring software paid for. After that initial 2 years, the funding becomes a bit more complicated, but at least you can give that jump start in. So it would be a question of how you fund it, what's the right tool, and then we can't pay for everything indefinitely, so is there like a sunset period? Is there a cost-sharing provision? But I think you actually have a good news story in how CISA's evolved and how you then could apply that to protect those small businesses, sir.
All right, and would that be, just to follow up on that a little bit, I mean, sort of a funding source, and I would assume we would knock out, for example, law firms that are doing litigation. I don't know that we'd have to protect those, but those that have certain qualify perhaps for national security providers of some kind, or what sort of parameters could we set so we could target whatever the funding is and get the most bang for the buck?
So I think there's a number of different ways you could go about doing this. One would be look at, I'm not saying we go full Communist Party, but what is our national list of critical technologies, and make the fact if you're in some way, shape, or form involved directly or indirectly with that list, you qualify. The other is to just closely look at universities. So I think the same logic actually applies to universities. The top 58 universities between 2002 and 2010 accounted for 37% of patents granted. right? So you're going to have to help both small businesses who are going to do kind of like fast follower. You know, they didn't build BARD or Llama 2, but they're going to be really creative in how they implement it. But you're also going to have to go upstream and look at those university ecosystems because their budgets are getting hit every year. We're pulling money back at the state level. Private institutions are even seeing lower enrollment. So I think there's going to have to be, the funding source will vary by the type of innovation and then even by the type of institution. So it would be both small businesses and universities. I do think larger businesses, even though they're important, they can make those harder choices. But those are the two I'd be most concerned about, sir.
And if I'm over time, but if I could ask just one last question. With respect to the larger companies who maybe aren't putting the money towards this that we would hope that they would you propose a certain set of standards that would guide them on that front, or should we just, you know, be requiring it at some level? How should we approach them?
Great question again, Congressman. I think honestly that's already been set in motion with some of the requirements to report cyber incidents. And the question is less about how do you do it, is harmonizing who they report to. So if you're a major company and you're publicly traded, are you reporting to the SEC first about this, or are you reporting absolutely up how it should be through CISA to actually make sure there's visibility on that compromise? So I think you've actually done a good job across parties on getting that right. It's just going to be harmonizing, because the last thing you want, even if you're a large business, is you get 3 phone calls, one from the FBI, one from the SEC, and then one from NSA, and then you're wondering, like, which one do I return to first? So I think those are in place for the larger companies. I think it's just a question of harmonizing that they know routinely which call they take first.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you to all the witnesses, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.